Lakeland Currents, your public affairs program for North Central Minnesota. Production funding for Lakeland Currents is made possible by Bemidji Regional Airport, serving the region with daily flights to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. More information available at bemidjiairport.org. Closed captioning for Lakeland Currents is sponsored by Nisswa Tax Service, tax preparation for businesses and individuals. Online at nisswatax.com.
Hello again, friends. I'm Jason Edens, your host of Lakeland Currents. Thanks for joining the conversation, and thanks for your ongoing support of Lakeland Public TV. As we all know, there's a very important election just around the corner. But to the League of Women Voters, every election is important, as it should be to all of us. Here to help us understand regional Get Out the Vote efforts is the president of the Brainerd chapter of the League of Women Voters, Becky LaPlante. Becky, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for making time. I'm really excited for our conversation today. I was wondering if we could start with just a general synopsis of the League, its history and its relevance today. It's my understanding that the League is celebrating its centennial. Is that correct?
It is. We are also celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and which is the amendment that gave women the right to vote. But yes, the League is 101 years old right now.
So tell us a little bit about how it was formed, what it's done over the course of the past century, and how it remains relevant today.
The League was formed through the suffrage movement during that time. Their goal has always been to educate voters, get out the vote efforts. For the longest time, they did all of the presidential forums, candidate forums too, which after seeing that last one, they could have used a couple of moms to put them in their corners and make them be quiet. On a local level, we host all of the local forums. So if it wasn't for the local leagues, you would not hear from your local school boards, from your local city council members, county candidates. We do all of the local stuff now.
Sure. So I guess I didn't realize that the League actually was a moderator for a lot of presidential debates in the past. If it hadn't been for the League, there might not have been any presidential debate. Is that right?
Yes, they did all of them up to, I'm not quite sure when it ended, about 30, 40 years ago. Oh, the League quit doing them, and the presidential a committee was formed that runs them now, which is the, what is it called? It's a bipartisan and candidate forum for the presidential debates. But yes, they were all run by the League of Women Voters to begin with.
Interesting, very interesting. So one of the things I've been really anxious to ask you is, when it's not election season, is the League idle? Does the League do stuff during non-election years, for example?
We do. We still do educational items. On off-season, on off-election years, that's when we can invite the candidates to our meetings and we can find out what they have been up to. Paul Gazelka and Carrie Rood came and spoke to us a couple of years ago, which was really nice. We check in with our county commissioners. We find out. We went out to the airport, and the Brainerd airport, and had them tell us what they were doing. So we check in with all of our elected officials and find out what's going on in the community. We run very interesting programs.
So your activity is actually all year, every year, and not just an election cycle. Is that correct?
It is.
Okay. And,
yes.
Another question I have is about your regional Get Out the Vote efforts, right? So every election year, it's my understanding that the League is behind a lot of voter registration efforts. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that generally, and then of course locally. I'm really curious what you're doing in our communities in order to help people register to vote.
Well, unfortunately, this year, most of our plans were curtailed with COVID. We did do one Get Out the Vote with CLC. We have done CLC events in the past, but yes, just very, very curtailed. We had a big event planned for the 100th anniversary, a local politicians coming in, big get out the vote thing, and we had to cancel that. So, sorry, but this year, not so much. Other leagues have done a few things, but most of the leagues in the state, we just haven't been able to do our usual stuff. The state league, we do have a website for Vote 411 that gives you all of the information on all of the candidates running. They've sent out questionnaires, and most candidates have filled out those questionnaires. The state league has been doing a vote from home push to encourage people to get their vote in early and vote by mail. But most of it has been virtual this year, just like everybody else.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that for the league, but you mentioned that you did have an event at CLC. I'm assuming you mean Central Lakes College. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that. So you were targeting students then at that event?
Yes. We target college students. We just check and see whether they're already registered, and if they're not, we register them. Often, this is their first time away from home, and they're not considering their old home anymore. So they need to register in a new place. And so we help them register here for Brainerd or Crow Wing County. And if they're still registered at home and consider their parents' home still their home, we show them how to get their absentee ballots and how to vote at their old home.
So was it a successful event? Did you register a lot of students, or?
It was quieter than normal because the campus is quiet. There's hardly anyone on campus. It was a wonderful event. Eric Hepner put together a great event. He had a band there, he had food, but the crowds weren't there because the campus is pretty empty right now.
Sure. Well, I'm curious, that's an interesting comment that you're making. So how do you think that will affect the voting process this season? If you're, not able to do what you would do in a typical year, do you think that'll have an impact in the polls, or in terms of the number of people that turn out to vote?
I don't think so. I think, from what I understand, our early voting numbers are higher than ever. The word is out to vote early. I was just on the phone talking to Hubbard County. She said that their numbers are way up, and usually they have 88% of their people voting. She's looking at over 90% of their population, eligible population voting. Our numbers in Minnesota are always high, and we think they're going to be really high this year.
Interesting. Well, since you brought that up, I was going to ask about that. I'm really curious to hear your opinion. So, of course, Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, has historically some of the highest rates of voter participation in the country. And I've always wondered why. And I'm just curious if you have an opinion on that. Do you know why Minnesota has such a commitment to turning out to the polls?
Well, a lot of it is because we do not make it too difficult to vote. We have a same-day voter registration, which 10 to 20% of people wait until the day, November 3rd this time, November 3rd to register to vote. And just to put the word out on this, you can, if your polling place is closed, a lot of polling places that are normally open are closed this time and went to only mail-in voting. If you find out that your mail-in voting or your poll is only mail-in voting, you can still go to the county courthouse on November 3rd and vote, register to vote, and vote that very same day. So that's a lot of it, is because we have that same day voter registration.
So that's not as common elsewhere in the country then, and that's part of the
no,
reason.
It's not.
Interesting. Well,
and now that we've
please.
And now that we've gone to early voting too, our numbers should be even higher.
Well, I actually wanted to ask you some of the nuts and bolts about voting. So for those people who haven't registered yet, or maybe this is their first time voting, what guidance would you provide to them in terms of making sure they can participate? Can you just walk us through, pretend that I've never voted before. How can I ensure that I can participate in this year's election?
Well, First, I encourage you to go online and check and find out where your polling place is going to be. Even if you've voted many, many times before, you may find that your polling place has changed this year, or they can't use schools. A lot of them have been combined, so that is a big one. And once you find out where your polling place is, if you're doing same-day voter registration, just walk in, make sure you have an ID with your current address on it. That's the easiest. If you have that, then you're done. You just walk in, give your ID, sign the paperwork, and you're ready to go. If you don't have an ID with your current address on it, you still need a picture ID with your name. And there's a couple, you can check and see what picture IDs are okay. And then you can bring in a bill, a utility bill, a lease, or a bank statement with your current address, and that will get you registered to vote. If you have none of that, you can still bring in a registered voter from that district, and they can vouch for you and say that they know that you that you live in that district and that you are who you say you are.
So if you bring someone with who can attest to the fact that you in fact live where you say you do, then that can facilitate the registration.
Right. They have to be a registered voter in that district.
Right. Thanks for the clarification there, because we really want to provide a service here and ensure that we're providing concrete information. So that's very useful. Now, you mentioned checking where your polling station is online. Can you repeat that website, please, or let us know where we should go so that we can be prepared before November 3rd?
Vote411.org.
So
It's vote411.org.
Okay, gotcha. And then if I go there, now is that just for Minnesota or is that a national website?
I think that one's national.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. The league has been pushing that one, and I believe that is national.
Okay.
But it's definitely for Minnesota. You can also go to the Secretary of State's website.
Sure. Now, you said that some polling stations may be closed this year. How come?
Because of COVID. There's a lack of election judges. We've been having problems with election judges for a while. A lot of judges are getting older and younger people are not stepping up. So there's been a lack. And now you have a lot of older people who do not want to be spending 16 hours meeting public. So that's made it even more difficult coming up with election judges. Then a lot of these polling places were in schools. The school district is not allowing people from the outside to come into schools.
Okay.
So they've had to find new locations. There's been a lot of interesting logistics this year.
Interesting.
So a lot of the, right.
Please.
A lot of the outer ones, smaller ones have gone to mail-in voting, and people were informed of that.
Well, I was going to ask you a little bit about election judges and the fact that a lot of folks are not participating this year on account of some healthcare concerns and things of that nature. But I also wanted to ask you a little bit more about your comments about the fact that younger folks aren't stepping up to fulfill this civic duty, frankly. Why is that? And what can the league do in order to encourage younger voters to actually serve the function of being election judges?
I think a lot of it is just getting the word out. People don't realize that it's not a difficult thing. You can take, the law says that your employer has to let you off of work if you give them a 20-day notice. So you can take a day off of work and be an election judge. You can take vacation time or just take the time off. You get paid for it too. It isn't just a volunteer. They pay, I'm not quite sure what they pay, maybe minimum wage. I'm an election judge, but I don't do it for the pay. I do it because, we need people doing this.
Sure.
And I think a lot of it is people don't think about it, and we just need to get the word out there. And when we do events at CLC, we always make sure we have information about becoming an election judge.
Interesting. So this year in Minnesota, there have been some changes to the voting cycle, the voting process. For example, it's my understanding, now correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that the election judges can continue to count absentee ballots up until 1 week after election. Is that right?
Yes, yes. So the ballots must be postmarked no later than on the 3rd. The post office, no matter what box you drop it into, your own mailbox, if it gets picked up by the post office on the 3rd, it will be a postmarked on the 3rd. I checked with the post office on that. That was quite interesting. They're pulling all ballots and not just sending them down to St. Cloud to be postmarked. They're postmarking them here in Brainerd if they get them on the 3rd to make sure they're postmarked on time. But we are encouraging people to please send the stuff in as early as possible. Once they're postmarked on the 3rd, they have a week to make it in, and the counties will be updating their counts on a daily basis as they get more in. So for 1 week after, so until the 10th, you can check your county website, and they'll have, at the end of the day, they'll have updated totals if they have gotten any new ballots in.
Now, did the league take a position on this change this year? I'm just curious if the league was kind of leaning its shoulder into the yoke, if you will, in terms of making some of these modifications to this year's process. Did the league have anything to do with that?
We do often, put our shoulder into it, as you say, and always on the side of making things as easy as possible. I don't know if we had anything to do with the extension, but you do not have to have a witness signature for your mail-in ballot, and our state league was instrumental in getting that passed.
Mm-hmm. Now, for those folks that have the opportunity to vote early through mail-in ballots and such, are there any guidelines or any details that we should be aware of to make sure? So you've mentioned, of course, the witness signature. That's not required this year on account of COVID, correct?
Right. I do make sure you sign it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
There are also drop boxes in every county.
Mm-hmm.
You can bring your mail-in ballot and to one of the drop boxes. Beltrami County has one, Hubbard County has one, Cass County has quite a few. Crow Wing County, they have a drop box, and they're doing drive-by where you can just drive in, hand it to election judges and drive off. They're running that from 9 until 5 daily over on 4th and Laurel. If you'd rather bring your mail-in ballot in and have it put into the counter, after the 27th of October, you can walk into our county courthouse and bring in your blank ballot, fill it out there, and put it right into the machine.
Okay.
There will also be, Crow Wing County is doing a couple of late night, the next 2 Thursdays, they will be open until 7 o'clock, so you can either early vote or you can drop off your mail-in ballot. Statewide Halloween Day is, all of the county courthouses will be open from 9 until 3 for early voting and drop off ballots. And Crow Wing County is the next, not this Saturday, but the last 2 Saturdays of the month.
So on Saturday, on Halloween, October 31st, we can actually go to the polls and vote early. So
yes.
In-person voting on Saturday the 31st. And that's throughout Minnesota?
Throughout Minnesota.
Okay.
From 9 until 3.
Okay. Well, I want to ask a couple more questions about the league. I'm really interested in its history, and I want to make sure, is the league a nonpartisan organization, or does it is nonpartisan?
Yes.
Okay. So,
nonpartisan nonprofit.
Nonpartisan nonprofit. Okay. Well, one of the things I've been really interested in is the voting process this year has become very politicized, and different entities are taking different positions on the voting process. But one of the things that I've been curious about is, in your chapter, is the shared passion for voter participation stronger than the powers of politicization, if you will?
I would think so. Oh, it's one of the main tenets of the League of Women Voters is expanding voter participation. So no matter which way the winds are blowing, whichever side is feeling more strongly about that, that does not really matter. We keep voting or pushing for voter participation. And hearing numbers like 80, 90% voter participation, that's what we want to hear all across the country.
Mhm. So
I'd like to hear 100, but
absolutely. So because the league is a nonpartisan nonprofit, I'm assuming then that you do not endorse candidates, correct?
we do not endorse candidates. We have very strict rules about that.
So the league has never endorsed a candidate in its 101-year history.
Not that I am aware of.
Interesting. Interesting.
It is in our rules. In fact, we cannot even have a person come speak to us
Mhm.
who is running for office that year unless we have their opponent. We have very strict rules about keeping everything as neutral and nonpartisan as possible.
Okay. Well, one of the things that you mentioned was the rates of voter participation here in Minnesota, of course, is at least in Hubbard County, it's 80%, elsewhere it's 90%. We're very proud of our voter participation. I'm curious what you think about some countries that actually have compulsory voting. I believe there are more than a handful of countries that actually mandate voting, and I'm just curious what you think about that. Is that one way that we can get the United States to vote in higher numbers? Because nationally it's around 50%, is that right, for presidential elections?
Yes, it's around 50%. Even Minnesota, I believe we're only statewide, we're probably about 60, 70%. People in the United States do not react well to mandatory anything.
Mhm.
So I don't think that would work. What would help is instead of having our election day on a Tuesday, having it on a Saturday. Weekends for most people work out better. If we started making it a holiday, even if we
Mhm.
kept it on Tuesday, making it a national holiday, where banks were closed and where most people had off. Things like that is more what we push than having a mandate, just making things easier for people.
Sure. Well, that's really interesting because I think that's one of the tenets of the For the People Act of 2019 is to turn Election Day into a national holiday. So even though you're a nonpartisan organization, you do advocate for various policy positions, correct?
Yes, in fact, if you go to both of our state site and the US site, you will see all of our policy positions on every issue. We do have legislative arm of the, where we push for different legislation and all to, again, make voting easier, help people vote.
I was reading some of that and I found it very interesting. I was going to ask you a couple questions about that. Actually, I'm curious, does the league support voting rights for felons?
Yes, they do. Or I believe that's a state policy on it. I know we do, or I do personally. I feel that once you're out of jail, you should be a full member of society. And curtailing a person's participation in society just makes them feel outside of everything and helps with recidivism. It does not make for a good citizen.
Interesting. I hadn't considered the recidivism component of that. You know, as we look at voter participation across the country, it's my understanding that voter participation and age are positively correlated, right? Generally speaking,
Mhm.
older populations are more inclined to vote than younger populations. And so,
They are.
although there's probably no answer to this, I'm curious why you think that's the case, and more importantly, what we can do about it. How can we increase voter participation among younger populations?
I think we're back to time again. Many older people, they have an easier time getting off of work. They have an easier time getting around. If you're retired, it's not a big deal to pop down and do something. And younger people, they're working, a couple of jobs. They have kids. They're, 20-hour days between kids and jobs. And you're like, oh, when am I going to go find time to vote?
Sure.
I think that's a lot of it.
Well,
So
this
we need
next
the holiday.
right, right. So I'm curious about the league and how people can participate. Are your meetings open to the public? How can people
They
get
are.
more engaged in the League of Women Voters?
Our meetings are open to the public and we do advertise them. You do not need to be a member to come to any of our meetings. We would, of course, love everyone as a member, and you do not have to be female. You can be male. Our president, 2 presidents ago, was a man. And so we welcome both men and women. And if you go to our state site, you can find links on how to get a hold of any one of your local leagues. Or just get a hold of me at the Brainerd League and I will find a way to get you in touch with the person that you need to be in touch with.
So are there leagues all across the state? Are there communities that don't have representation from the league, or?
There are leagues all over the state. As we get further up north, we're so spread out here.
Mhm.
Our Bemidji has one, on Park Rapids has one. We have the Brainerd Lakes area, and we try to cover as much as we can in our area. But we're a small league; we can only do so much.
Sure.
There isn't one in Little Falls. There's one in St. Cloud.
Well, we only have about a minute or two left here, and I just wanted to ask 1 or 2 final questions, and they're kind of big picture questions, but I really enjoyed learning more about the league in preparation for our conversation, Becky. And one of the things that I discovered was that the league advocates for statehood for the District of Columbia, for Washington, D.C., the actual district.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious then, does that mean that the league also supports statehood for U.S. territories like Puerto Rico?
I'm not quite sure what the U.S. League's position is on that. I'm sorry, I didn't phone up on those to
That's
find
quite
out. But I definitely understand the push to make DC a full voting member in the United States. It's a shame to have such a large portion of the population not have a larger voice in how our country is run.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to close with one final question, and I found a really interesting quote on your website, and I'm just interested in getting your opinion, and I understand this is from your national website, but I found it very interesting that the league is supporting the For the People Act, and of course that has a great deal to do with voter participation and gerrymandering and things of that nature. And the quote is, "The American people deserve to know that we are allowing big money interests to hide in the shadows and influence the votes of the American people." So I'm curious, what does the league see as a solution to that? Or from your own personal perspective, how can we limit the influence of money in our electoral process?
I wish I was that intelligent and knew how to fix big money issues in our politics. I was just thinking about that the other day. I don't know how you get the money out of politics. I was listening to the questioning of our probably new Supreme Court justice, and they were talking about the big money in there, and I just don't know how to do it. And I'm not sure anyone really has a great idea on how to do it anymore.
Well, it's a thorny, difficult question. And I think what you're doing to encourage voter participation is probably fundamental to finding the solution. So, Becky, I want to thank you first and foremost for your work to encourage the integrity of our elections and to encourage participation. I really appreciate what you do for our community, and I thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to thank all of you for joining the conversation again. I'm Jason Edens, your host of Lakeland Currents. Be kind and be well. We'll see you next week.